start with the first bill. What you're looking at right here, you're looking at the slide I'm showing you has to do with debt, our debt, and the percentage in relation to the gross domestic product, which is essentially the way that we measure the extent of our economy. And the first thing I want you to know is that the situation we're in today is not new. We have been here before. In fact, in World War II, the percent of our debt compared to our gross domestic product was 100%. Today, it's actually, in 2010, it was approaching, it was over 50% and increasing. But the point here is this, is that America has solved this before. We have to be committed to solving it in the future. You'll note that after World War II, we got hold of our debt, and by the way, that was because we decreased expenditures, but also we grew the economy. It was a mixture of both, and we came out of that. Okay, next slide. Here's the problem. This is the path we're on. This is the path that we're on right now. This year's deficit is $1.65 trillion in 1 year. This is the largest on record. We cannot continue on this path. We have a $14 trillion debt. It's hard to get your arms around what $14 trillion are. But just to give you a sense of it, for every new baby, we don't tax babies, and we never should, of course, right? But to give you a sense, when a new baby's born, that baby has $45,000 worth of debt. Every taxpayer, if you just look at taxpayers, this is north of $90,000 per taxpayer. That's how much debt we have. This is enormous debt. Go to the next slide. Okay, what I want to do is give you a sense of what's happened here. This is 1960, looking out to 2020. This is a percent of gross domestic product. What you're going to see is the red line is spending, the blue line is our taxes, or receipts to the government, okay? And what I want you to see is that only 10 years ago, the blue line was higher than the red line. We had a surplus only 10 years ago. Now look, as somebody who just came from the Army last year, I have said this repeatedly, but I want to say it once here. I think both parties contributed to this mess. You know, and I don't find it helpful when the Democrats point to Republicans and when the Republicans point to Democrats. Because I can tell you that I can find enough empirical research to support the fact that both parties got us to this position where we are today. And what we really need to do is focus as the American people to work our way out of it. But I wanted to tell you that we can change this. Note that the reason why we had a surplus is because we increasingly got a hold of our spending for a period of about a decade, and our receipts went up. Now, our receipts went up. Is that because taxes went up? No, taxes didn't go up. The reason why receipts went up is because we grew the economy. This was a period of significant economic growth for our country, and because of that, when I'm talking about significant, 4 to 5% GDP growth, and what that did is that put more in the coffers of the Treasury to eventually the point where we had a surplus. Now, I recently voted to cut $100 billion from the current operating year, 2011. And that's because I want to explain to you why I did that. I believe we need to roll back to pre-TARP, pre-stimulus 2008 levels. And I didn't just pick that out of the air. The reason why is I want you to take a look here. The last time that our spending was below 20%, this is generally the threshold where economists will tell you that you need to be below 20% of your federal spending in relation to gross domestic product if you want to have a healthy economy and if you also want to make sure that you're towards a balanced budget. Okay? So when we roll back, what we're doing is we're gaining back control of this situation because this was the last deficit that was between 100 and 200 billion dollars, which by the way then was unacceptable. But look what happened. We essentially went to a significant deficit to where we are today. Now keep in mind that it wasn't just the spending, although the spending did go significantly up. Notice also the receipts dropped. Why this is important is we lost $300 billion in the deficit just on the recession. That's why I believe that if we take policies that facilitate growth, if we aggressively attack those impediments, those impediments to growth, and we grow this economy, I think we can make up a quarter of the deficit. About 25% of the deficit we can make up with economic growth. If we can get back to 4 to 5%, 4 to 4.5% gross domestic product growth, we'll put America back to work, and we'll begin to close the deficit. But we've got to do much more than just grow the economy, because we've got 75% of the deficit that's not addressed. Even if we assume for a second the best growth that we've had in the post-World War II era, we would still be 75% red ink compared to where it should be. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, now, when you start to talk about what our budget is, it's important to get a sense of what we spend money on. This is our entire federal spending, $3.5 trillion. Now, what I want you to take away from this slide is that about 42% of what we spend is what's called in DC and throughout America as discretionary spending. Okay, that's the money that your legislators decide year to year what they're going to spend money on. So the takeaway from that is 58% of what we spend is so-called mandatory spending. Your legislatures don't vote on it because it's already in law and it's going out the door. That's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory, and net interest. We paid $202 billion on nothing but interest on our debt. Okay. Why I show this slide is I want you to know that when I voted for $100 billion in cuts, I think that that was the right move. Now, some in the auditorium here are going to say I cut too much. Those on that side say the cuts were deep and reckless. What I say is you're half right. They were deep, but they weren't reckless. They were necessary. There are some in this room here who don't think we cut enough. There's a member in Congress that said we should cut $500 billion from the current operating year. I want to communicate to you why I don't agree with that. Okay? Here's why. The current operating year, we only address discretionary spending in the current operating year. We address mandatory spending in the budget, which we will address later on, and that goes out 10 to 20 years. But for the CR, the continuing resolution, if one was to look at $500 billion in the current year, let's take a look at what would happen. First of all, we're halfway through the current year, which means, look at, you had $666 billion right here, 692. This is defense, by the way, if you can't see it in the back. This is defense spending, 692 billion. This is non-defense discretionary, 666 billion. Okay, you're halfway through the fiscal year, which means that you've got roughly 330 billion left in discretionary spending. So if we cut $500 billion in this current year, as one senator recommended, that would mean absolutely no more spending for the next 6 months in any of the federal categories. None. That talks about the roads, the bridges. You know, we're talking about anything that your departments would be working on. They wouldn't be able to spend a dime. And what's more is that wouldn't even be enough. You would still have to go in a time of war when troops from Columbia County and from Chatham are in the field fighting an enemy on your behalf, whether you agree they should be there or not. They're there for you. We would be cutting $200 billion from the defense area. Now, I don't agree with that, and I wanted you to understand why. This is why we have to take the long view from my perspective. I think the $100 billion was deep but necessary so that we could roll back to spending levels that were fiscally responsible. And then later on, this year, when we address the budget, we're going to put everything on the table. We're going to put everything on the table across the full spectrum of this budget. We're going to address it later on. Ma'am, did you have a quick point?